Welcome to my channel. I never imagined my life unfolding this way. Over the last 18 years, I've felt unhappy, with no sign of relief on the horizon. I'm not even certain how it all transpired. One moment I was a carefree single man, and before I realized, I found myself married and not as happy as I once was. I wouldn't describe Sherry as a beauty queen, but she was kind and accessible, which was critical for someone like me. Her kindness and openness made it simple to invite her out, and I didn't feel the risk of rejection. This led to a consistent relationship, and a year later, when I secured a permanent position at the pump factory, we married. Now, 18 years later, I'm still employed at the pump factory and remain married. The major change is that we now have 2 kids. I've always been a relaxed individual, never aiming to be a boss or business owner. I adhered to the principle of blending in and avoiding conflict, whatever that entails, no stirring trouble or offending anyone. Most of the time, I managed it well. What do I mean by most of the time? Regarding my marriage, it hasn't been quite successful. Sherry soon realized she could manipulate my laid-back nature to get her way. As a wife, I had few complaints about Sherry. She cooked well, kept the house tidy, was generally loving, especially in the initial years, and took good care of herself. However, she began to dominate as soon as she grasped that she could do so, and she was not very economical. I had always hoped to purchase a home, but whenever I saved a bit of money, Sherry would find something to spend it on. Consequently, we are still in a rental home, and our credit cards are perpetually maxed out. Our family life was rocky. My son Dwight, 16, had been arrested twice for drug dealing. One more incident, and he would be ineligible for probation. Our 17-year-old daughter, Gemma, fully embraced the goth lifestyle, which was beyond my comprehension, yet her mother wholly supported her. Family dinners were a rarity. I seldom saw or interacted with my children. My wife made it clear that I should keep out of it and that she would handle the kids. Naturally, my relationship with my wife did not fare much better. A few years back, she took a position at a local insurance agency. I'm unsure what her role involved, but she liked it, so I stayed silent. She declared it was her money to spend as she saw fit, which meant it rarely went towards groceries, rent, or utilities, but rather on clothing and visits to the salon. Over the years, as her income and wardrobe expanded, I enjoyed my role at the factory. I moved up to become a head assembler. We didn't produce general market pumps, but rather specialized ones for particular applications. My job was to make sure we had all the necessary parts for each project. It might not have been an ambitious career, but it suited me well. The pay was decent, and we benefited from healthcare coverage. About 5 years ago, I started to suspect that Sherry was unfaithful. It didn't take long to confirm, as she made no effort to conceal it. I tolerated all the typical weak excuses for her absences and never confronted her. Our intimate life gradually waned until it vanished entirely. She never complained, and I eventually understood why her salary was so substantial. It turned out she was involved with her boss, Malcolm. In response, I began to save some money quietly and also took up a new hobby, carving. I wasn't very familiar with wood carving, but I owned a pocket knife. I soon learned that serious wood carvers typically do not use pocket knives, although movies and TV shows often portray them as doing so. After some time, I obtained several quality carving knives and additional tools. I started with carving small animal figures and gradually advanced to more intricate pieces. I discovered that spending time alone in the basement provided me with relaxation and enjoyment. I realized I was more of a whittler than a carver. I'm not certain about the distinction, but the term whittler seemed more appropriate. Then, I came across poplar bark, and my carving hobby gained a new dimension. The main challenge was locating high-quality bark. Eventually, I sourced poplar bark from Montana. Most carvings from poplar bark tend to be whimsical houses or tree spirits. I chose to concentrate on crafting these houses, and as my enthusiasm for bark carving increased, my connections with my family slowly diminished. My future appeared bleak, and I lacked both the motivation and the desire to alter it. I resigned myself to the prospect of dying as a lonely old man in my basement, whittling away. By then, I hardly cared anymore, and then I received a phone call. "Hello, Curtis Langford. Yes, this is Marcia Hurd. Your wife works with my husband at Eagle Home Insurance. I believe we met a few years back at one of the company gatherings. I'm sorry, Mrs. Hurd, I don't remember meeting you. I rarely attend company events. In any case, the company is hosting an awards ceremony this Friday, and you should plan on coming. It will be interesting. Nothing too formal, just a suit and tie will suffice. I don't think so, Mrs. Hurd. My wife usually prefers not to have me at these events with her. She might be concerned that I could embarrass her or something. I don't think I'll be able to attend, but thank you for the invite. This is more than just an invitation, Mr. Langford. I really believe it's in your best interest to come. I've already reserved seats for you and your wife. They serve excellent ribs there. We'll see. But don't count on it. I'm sure you'll come, Mr. Langford. See you on Friday. It was an odd conversation with someone I had never met. I lacked both the interest and the desire to go to such events. How would Sherry react when she arrived home? I wondered if I should even mention Mrs. Hurd's call. Maybe I should buy a new tie. I decided to go online and order a new batch of woodbark. I had plenty of carving work ahead. It was nearly 8 p.m. when my wife finally returned home. As usual, I had already dined. Sorry for being late, dear. We're handling a lot of claims due to last month's storm. Did you make dinner? Yes. Did you eat already? We ordered pizza to the office. I received an interesting phone call today from Mrs. Hurd. There's a company event on Friday night, and she insists that we both go. I told her you would probably be there, but not me. She insisted that we both need to attend. I have no clue why, and I didn't want to argue with her. Let's see if you can sort this out by week's end. Why would Mrs. Hurd call you? I have no interest in attending any of your company's social gatherings. You know that. Just handle it. It must be significant if she took the time to call. Maybe you should just switch jobs. That might be easier than upsetting her. You do realize she's the actual owner of the company, not Malcolm, right? No, I didn't know that, and frankly I don't care. Why are you so insistent on this? Do you really want to know? I feel awkward and humiliated around all your colleagues because they know what our relationship is like. I don't understand why you won't do whatever it takes to make me leave. Apparently, it doesn't bother you. What on earth are you talking about? Everyone at your company knows about your relationship with Malcolm Hurd. Every time they see me, they smirk, giggle, or make snide remarks. I can handle it by staying away from them, which is why I just keep my distance. Curtis, you're not thinking clearly. I don't know where you're getting these odd thoughts. You're going on Friday, that's definite. Buy a new tie. No, forget it. I'll buy you a new tie. Interestingly, she neither denied nor defended her affair with Malcolm Hurd. She simply ignored it. If you don't talk about it, it doesn't exist. This was the first time I had ever mentioned or hinted at her affair. There was no reaction from her. For years, I had tried not to stir things up, and when I finally did, it seemed not to matter. It was as though she didn't care whether I knew or not. I decided I needed a way out. I couldn't tolerate this any longer. I would move on. I had 4 days to prepare, though what exactly I was preparing for, I wasn't sure. For 18 years I had been the nice guy. I had wasted half my life. By the time Friday arrived, I was ready. All the options had been considered, and one had been chosen. The toughest part was deciding what to do about the kids. I assumed they were both mine, but I hadn't truly acted as a parent to either of them. I had tried, but I had failed. Sherry had managed to alienate them from me, and I had allowed it. As a result, they were no longer my responsibility. All I could do was support them financially. Sherry took a few minutes to ensure my tie was correctly tied, and I swear I saw her smirking as she did it. On the way there, I was reminded not to cause a scene or do anything that might embarrass her. It was going to be a long night, but that night never really happened. There were only about 50 or 60 people there, and I didn't recognize anyone. Sherry quickly moved away from me, so I headed to the open bar and grabbed a bottle of whatever beer they had. I hadn't even finished my first one when I noticed a few younger guys glancing in my direction and smiling. As I turned away, I caught the word cuck and heard some chuckles. "Hi, I'm Gary Jones. You're Curtis, right? Sherry's husband." He extended his hand. I shook his hand and just nodded silently, confirming my identity. We stood there for a few seconds, neither of us quite sure how to start a conversation. "So Curtis, how long have you and Sherry had an open marriage? I've heard about arrangements like that, but I've never met anyone who actually lives that way." He smiled and waited for some kind of response. He wasn't being smug to him, it was a genuine question. I noticed a small group of women nearby looking in my direction and giggling. If I stayed, it was going to be a long night. I hadn't been there even 10 minutes. I set my half-empty bottle on the counter, turned to my companion, and shook his hand again. "It was nice to meet you, Gary Jones. Have a good evening." I turned and quietly walked out of the building. I spent the next hour loading up my 10-year-old truck. I was glad I had spent so much time preparing. I was trying to decide whether or not to take the George Foreman grill when my cell phone rang. Curtis, are you there? This is Marcia Hurd. Yes, I'm here. How can I help you, Mrs. Hurd? You disappeared. I saw you and your wife arrive, but then you were gone. You missed an important part of the evening. I wanted you to be there. I don't understand. What exactly did I miss? At 8 tonight, my husband Malcolm was served with divorce papers, and your wife was also served with a court summons. Since I own the company, they were both fired as well. I wanted to do it in a way that would maximize their humiliation. That's why I wanted you there to embarrass your wife as much as possible. Wow, sorry I missed that. I admire your creativity. I didn't know what else to say, so there was a brief silence. Are you going to be okay, Mrs. Hurd? Yes, of course. Why do you ask? Just trying to be a little tactful. Well, thanks for the call. I need to get going. Best of luck with your business. Goodbye. I hung up before she could continue the conversation. I had a long drive ahead of me. The evening had gone much better than I had expected. I decided to bring the George Foreman grill with me. My brother Stan and his wife Barbara lived in Huntsville. Stan owned his own business servicing garage doors and gates at private storage facilities. There were more than 100 storage units in the area, which meant thousands of doors constantly needed repair. He had more work than he could manage. Some larger facilities employed their own maintenance staff, but for most it was more cost-effective to outsource the work. I moved in with my brother and immediately started working with him. After 3 weeks, I began searching for work independently, which was a refreshing change of pace. I kept my old phone but removed the SIM card. Stan provided me with a new phone for work purposes. I also began looking for an apartment because staying in the guest room was not a long-term solution. I didn't communicate with Sherry or anyone from back home. Nobody knew where I was. I acquired an Alabama driver's license and registered my Subaru. Life was going well. I had a small apartment just a few minutes' walk from Stan and Barbara. I set up a wood carving station in one of the bedrooms and bought a small deep fryer to complement the George Foreman grill. I didn't adopt a keto diet, but I started monitoring my carb intake. Over 6 months, I lost 15 pounds. I didn't miss my old life, but it felt like I never got any closure. I expected someone to come looking for me, but that never happened. No one seemed to care that I had left. Perhaps they missed my money, but they certainly didn't miss me. I was never served with divorce papers or any demands for support. I had a few sleepless nights worrying about it, but I quickly moved past it. Finally, one day, I decided it was time. Hello, Curtis. Is that you? Her voice sounded normal. Yes, I'm just calling to see if you filed for divorce. Why do you ask? Are you thinking about getting married again? No, but I thought you might. I don't want to stand in your way. There was a brief pause. Curtis, where are you? Don't you ever think about coming home? I hadn't planned on it. As far as I'm concerned, things are fine the way they are. What about you? I'm afraid not so well. Fortunately, you called on a Sunday. I usually spend most of the day working. In the mornings, I work at Waffle House, and in the evenings, I do shopping at Kroger. It's the only way I can afford to pay rent, utilities, and car insurance. Sorry to hear that. What happened with your company? I didn't get a response. I waited a few moments. Aren't the kids able to help you out? They're both old enough to work. Dwight got caught selling drugs again, and he's serving 2 years at a juvenile center in Graterford. Gemma is in California with a guy named Rocco. I never did learn his last name, so they're not much help. Well, Sherry, I'm sorry things aren't working out for you. If you decide you want a divorce, just let me know. How am I supposed to do that? I don't have your address, and you keep your phone off at that moment. I quietly pressed the hang-up button. I blocked her number and turned off my phone. I would need to buy a new cell phone, perhaps something smarter. The turning point in my new life came the following month. There was a craft show at the Von Braun Center in Huntsville. Stan and Barbara insisted that I attend. One of Barbara's childhood friends was participating in the show and wanted to meet me. It sounded like some kind of setup, which I resisted, but I really wanted to see the show. Susie Doyle had displayed small figurines made from ceramics, each about 15 to 20 cm tall and featuring a unique black finish. The figurines were unusual. They were animals, but unlike any I had seen before. Some resembled penguins with heads like pelicans. I noticed a few small cat figurines with faces that looked like owls. They were, to say the least, unique. After the introduction, I had many questions. I probably should have been more interested in Susie herself, but I got caught up showing more interest in her artwork. Why are they all black? Do you burn them yourself? Are those real wood shavings or pellets? Why are some parts shiny and others dull? Susie found my questions reasonable and took the time to answer each as I asked them. Stan and Barbara were smiling, and Barbara seemed to be giggling slightly. They excused themselves and continued exploring the exhibition. I stayed behind and talked with Susie. I spent more time with her than I had with any other woman. We didn't discuss anything personal, but I asked if I could visit her at her home. She was quite open to the idea. Half an hour later, Stan and Barbara returned, and we stopped at Outback for dinner. Curtis, do you realize that ever since we left the convention center, all you've talked about is Susie and her animals? Barbara mentioned this with a kind smile. I paused for a moment. I guess so. I liked her, and I also liked her quirky little animals. I felt comfortable with her. Stan leaned across the table and looked me in the eye. That's great, Curtis. Don't let this one slip away. I felt a bit embarrassed, and Stan and Barbara noticed. They both grinned when I told them I planned to visit her that weekend. Finding Boaz using GPS was straightforward, but locating Susie's actual place was a bit more challenging. It wasn't farmland or ranch land, just rural countryside. The house sat back from the road about 100 meters or so. There were several outbuildings, more than one might expect. I wouldn't say it was neat, but it wasn't shabby either. You could say it looked lively. Additionally, it was very secluded. I was greeted with a hug and the barking of a dog, who quickly calmed down once it realized I wasn't a threat. The chickens, on the other hand, didn't seem to care one way or the other. We started the day with coffee and a relaxed conversation. She was eager to show me how she worked with ceramics. About 30 meters behind the house, there was a small hill, and on one side you could see where she extracted the clay. There were several roughly made stands with wire mesh bottoms that she used to sift the clay before bringing it home. It quickly became clear how she managed to maintain her fit figure. Hauling a wheelbarrow full of clay back to the workshop over a bumpy road was no easy task. A few hours later, I was thoroughly impressed. The only thing I didn't understand was what the sawdust had to do with it. She explained that it would come after lunch. The sawdust was used for firing the ceramic figurines. She would load a 250-liter barrel with sawdust and green clay figurines, then set it alight. It took several days for the smoldering fire to reach the bottom of the barrel, by which time all the figurines were fired. The finer the sawdust, the slower the fire would burn. We had a couple of sandwiches for lunch, then sat on the porch. She placed a cooler between two massive rocking chairs and smiled. I think she called Stan and Barbara before I arrived. The cooler was full of dark brown bottles. We didn't make it to the sawmill, but we certainly enjoyed a few cold ones. Susie made us pasta for dinner, and I spent the rest of the evening drinking coffee. No, I didn't stay the night. I really needed the GPS to find my way back home. I started spending a lot more time in Boaz, which seemed to make Stan and Barbara happy. Although I had no real interest in making ceramic figurines like Susie did, I was fascinated by the process and enjoyed learning how she did it. Of course, during this time I didn't do much with carving. I spent a few days improving the path from the clay pit to the workshop. I also managed to get a heavy-duty two-wheel cart to replace the wheelbarrow, which I thought was a bit cumbersome. The primary way to control the firing speed in her sawdust kilns was by regulating the airflow. The type and texture of the available sawdust also affected the firing process. I managed to adapt an old lawnmower to shred the sawdust, which slowed down the burning process. Susie was thrilled with my efforts. One thing led to another, and eventually I ended up spending the night in Boaz. Susie and I became much closer by that time. We were discussing personal matters. I carefully explained my family situation to her, making an effort not to sound resentful. She wasn't overly concerned that I was married. Her circumstances were slightly different. Susie had been married for 30 years. They had no offspring. Her spouse, Dave, had recently retired, and shortly after they relocated, he experienced a heart attack. When it occurred, he was at the rear of their residence. By the time she discovered him, he was beyond saving. Their sole income was his pension, which would cease if he passed away. Therefore, she ensured he was never declared deceased. She showed me where he was laid to rest, and I believe I noticed a subtle tear in her eye. Susie had concealed his death for more than 3 years. Handling the federal income tax was the obstacle, but in the era of digital technology, that was effortlessly managed. The pension check arrived monthly, and everyone was content. A benefit of residing in Boaz is that no one disturbs you. While I lived in Huntsville and kept working for Stan on weekends, I spent time with Susie. She was as intrigued by my wood carving as I was by her ceramics. I had a tiny section in her studio for my carving. Unfortunately, I had scant time for it. The house she had once shared with Dave required significant repairs. Assisting her in the studio and maintaining the property left me little time for carving. Dad phoned me from Ocala yesterday. Stan intercepted me before I started my duties on Monday. Is everything all right? Is Mum okay? Yes, they're fine. He called to inform me they received a letter from an attorney in Pennsylvania regarding your divorce. Sherry wasn't sure where to send it, so she asked them to forward it. I told him to send it to me, and I'll ensure you receive it. Damn, it's nice to receive some positive news for a change. What are you planning to do? I think I'll just sign it and return it. Perhaps it would be wise to have someone review it first. What do you reckon? We employed an attorney for the business. I'll request him to examine it. The divorce was fairly uncomplicated, so I just signed it and mailed it back. She retained everything that was there, and I kept all that was with me. Now, it was merely a matter of waiting 90 days. Susie seemed happy to hear about it but didn't emphasize it much. About 3 months later, I was living in Boaz full-time. I was still employed by Stan, but I had joined the morning caravan heading to Huntsville. Similar to thousands of ants, the residents of rural areas south of Huntsville migrated north each morning. To give you an idea, at the same time, countless similar ants streamed down from the hills of Tennessee. Jobs and employment opportunities in Huntsville were flourishing, and people were ready to commute for the higher salaries. Cars traveled bumper to bumper northward in the mornings and returned each evening. Life was favorable. I was no longer married. Susie was active in the craft community and maintained a schedule of all the craft shows and fairs in the area. At least once a month, she participated in an event to present her creations. With some encouragement, she also began selling them online, though the high shipping costs somewhat limited her sales. I frequently heard her quietly grumbling about Amazon, baffled by how they could ship items practically for free. I usually didn't accompany Susie to the sales events. By then, I had accumulated quite a large collection of wood carvings. I had given some to Stan and Barbara, but kept most for myself, never believing they were good enough to sell. Susie asked if she could take a few pieces to her next show, and I consented. When she returned from the recent show, I had dinner prepared. How did it go? Not bad. I sold 28 pieces. I'll need to work to restock for the next show. She handed me a handful of cash. What's this? I counted over $500. I sold your fairy houses and received orders for more. Wow, I didn't expect that. I was hoping you might sell a few, but I never thought you'd sell them all. It's fantastic that I sold them. The downside is that I sold them too cheaply. How do you know that? I discovered that one of the buyers, who bought a couple, had his own stall at the fair. I sold them to him for $60, and he took them to his stand and resold them for more. I felt foolish. I didn't realize they were worth that much. I didn't know either. I'm unsure whether I should be upset or flattered. Either way, don't worry, you did a great job. Next time I'll set a proper price and bring more with me. That chili smells delicious. I'd better order more bark. The problem arose at the end of October. Susie was digging in the pit, and I was higher up the slope, trying to figure out how to get a dry cedar log back to the house. Cedar wood would be perfect for carving comfort birds. I heard him before I saw him. You're not easy to find, Mr. Langford. He sounded out of breath, as if climbing the hill had been a struggle. I was sure his extra weight and beer belly didn't help. What really caught my attention, though, was the large revolver in his right hand. What can I do for you? I racked my brain, trying to figure out who he was. He seemed familiar, but I couldn't place him. You've already done too much. It took me years to find you, you son of a. Suddenly, I remembered this was Malcolm Hurd, my wife's former lover. I was puzzled by the fact that I had nothing to do with his downfall. I was just an uninvolved observer. His wife had orchestrated and carried out everything. I was trying to figure out how to explain that to him when I heard a loud thud and saw him drop the gun and slowly slump to the side. Susie was standing behind him, holding a shovel. She looked at me, tilted her head, and said, "Oops." We both sat down on an old poplar stump by the path. After waiting a few minutes, we both started to get worried. "How hard did you hit him? He should have come around by now." Susie just looked at me and shrugged. It felt a bit awkward sitting there like that. A few minutes later, I stood up, leaned over, and put my hand on his neck. There was no pulse. I sat back down on the log. What the heck are we going to do now? Her tone held more curiosity than concern. I guess we could call the sheriff and claim it was self-defense, but that could turn into a mess. It took a bit more time to think things through. We could just bury him next to Dave and pretend nothing happened. I was surprised by how calm Susie was under the circumstances. I know this is a strange question, but did you keep Dave's wallet and personal belongings before you buried him? Yes, I still have his wallet, watch, and wedding ring at home. Why do you ask? Did any of the neighbors know Dave or spend much time with him? No, not at all. Dave kept to himself. We never visited anyone, and we didn't go to parties or anything like that. Did he look anything like Mr. Hurd? I mean, could he pass for Dave's same age, weight, and build? Dave wore glasses. I have them at home along with his other things. What are you thinking? I'm not sure if it will work, but I was thinking that if we could get a death certificate for this man, we might be able to pass him off as your husband and get you out of the pension fraud situation. Isn't that risky? What if someone recognizes him? We sat in silence for a few more moments. I'm going to go get Dave's things from the house. I'll be back soon. While Susie was gone, I took the opportunity to assess the situation. The terrain was a bit uneven and rocky. He had a few scrapes and a bit of blood on the back of his head. I carefully moved the body with a medium-sized rock and spread as much blood on the rock as I could. There wasn't much blood, but enough to suggest he had a head injury. It looked like an accidental fall. I took his wallet, watch, phone, car keys, and wedding ring. With Dave's glasses, he looked generic enough to be difficult to identify. DMV photos aren't usually very clear. Susie called 911. The paramedics confirmed that he was indeed dead. They called the local funeral home and the sheriff's office. Both arrived within 20 minutes, and 10 minutes later Mr. Malcolm Hurd was on his way to cremation. While Susie Doyle received the death notice of her late husband that evening, Susie accompanied me as I drove Malcolm's car to Birmingham. I left it unlocked near the Kit Kat Club, placing his wallet and phone on the front seat. 2 days later, the funeral home issued death certificates for David Doyle. After a brief visit to the TVA headquarters in Chattanooga, Susie managed to halt the pension payments and also collect a $100,000 insurance payout. That evening, we celebrated at a diner. I was impressed by how smoothly everything proceeded. The paramedics were effective and knew their tasks well. The sheriff's department official was content with their conclusion of death and saw no reason to involve a coroner. The funeral home staff wanted to remove the body as quickly as possible. No one even looked at the driver's license. I remained unobtrusive the whole time and allowed Susie to handle everything. She did an excellent job. Since Susie no longer received Dave's pension money, she needed to find another method to obtain additional funds. She decided that the simplest approach would be to marry me. I couldn't say no. After all, she still possessed that troublesome shovel. Thank you for listening to the end. See you in the next episode of Cheating Stories. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Goodbye.